Good morning, brothers and sisters, and happy Feast of Saint Mark. Today we're celebrating a great saint, Saint Mark, one of the four gospel writers. But let me ask you this, great saints, sometimes we think they were just born that way, or they just were always perfect, or something along those lines. But I think we can learn from the example of Saint Mark that the greatest of saints oftentimes struggled in being faithful to the call of the Lord in their lives. For example, St. Mark, we read about him in the Acts of the Apostles. St. Paul, during his first apostolic journey, had a team of missionaries with him. Mark was one of those missionaries. And this is what we read. Oh, that's the Spanish one. All right, so now Paul and his company set sail from Paphos and came to Perga in Pamphylia. And John left them and returned to Jerusalem. Now this John, who is John? Well, John is Mark. Mark was sort of his nickname, you might say. So it's John Mark. And so John, it just says kind of in passing, left them and returned to Jerusalem. Well, may not seem like a big deal, but later on in the Acts of the Apostles, we get more insight into what happened. Paul and Barnabas are preparing for their second apostolic journey. And this is what they say to each other. After some days, Paul said to Barnabas, "Come, let us return and visit the brethren in every city where we have proclaimed the word of the Lord and see how they are." And Barnabas wanted to take with them John, called Mark. But Paul thought best not to take with them one who had withdrawn from them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. So here we see that Paul was affected. When Mark left, I don't want to say he chickened out, but he was kind of like, here we are, we got a mission to do, and all of a sudden he just leaves and goes back to Jerusalem. So much so that, Paul does not want him to come back on any missionary journey. Basically, he's like, Mark can't take it. Mark's not strong enough. Mark can't do it. Right? And so you might say Mark failed. Mark failed in this mission. Okay, so at that point, I'm sure it was difficult for St. Mark. He goes back to Jerusalem. He's probably feeling guilty and bad, but he's probably frustrated. And you might say, well, why not just give up? Why not just stop? Why not just abandon the call of the Lord? Why not just leave the Christian life? Well, Mark doesn't do that. We know from other writings in the Bible that Mark goes on to meet up with St. Peter. And he joined St. Peter in his great apostolic work in Rome. And in the first reading of today's Mass, we read that Mark greets all the Christians to whom St. Peter is writing. Mark became a faithful companion of St. Peter, and ultimately from the proclamation of the gospel that he witnessed from St. Peter, he wrote the Gospel of St. Mark. We also know from the second letter of St. Timothy that Paul, in the last days of his life, would look back on Mark and say that he was a tremendous helper in the mission of spreading the gospel. Which gives us insight. Mark and Paul, they reconciled, and Mark ended up helping Paul quite a bit in his own apostolic labors. And so, brothers and sisters, even if we fail, it's not over, right? We humble ourselves, we lift ourselves back up with the grace of God, and we keep moving forward. We keep going. We keep tirelessly struggling to complete the mission, spreading the gospel that the Lord has given us. So let's go to Our Lady and ask her to pray for us, that we might not get discouraged or lose hope in the midst of the struggles, but that we might see in them precisely an opportunity to persevere and to grow in holiness. God bless you, brothers and sisters.